My next great adventure, age 90, is going to be dying. There's either nothing or something, and if there's something, if there's nothing, and that's it.
That was Jane Goodall speaking about life and death, but now disturbing footage has surfaced showing her final moments, and shockingly, her beloved animals may have played a role. The video is sparking fear and confusion across the internet. So what really happened? Let's break it down. The viral death news and her final adventure. When news of Jane Goodall's death at the age of 91 began circulating online, it wasn't the simple reporting of a passing that captured public attention. Instead, the story came tied with video clips, headlines, and snippets of her own words that seemed to foreshadow her end. Some outlets and viral posts referred to disturbing death footage, but what they often showed was not a graphic video of Goodall herself, but rather interviews she had given about mortality, her next great adventure, and, in some cases, montages juxtaposing her death with violent scenes of the very animals she studied. The result was a swirl of confusion, fascination, and in some corners, sensationalism. In the months leading up to her death, Goodall spoke candidly about the subject that most avoid until the end of life. She framed death not with fear but with curiosity, as if it was simply the next step in a long journey of discovery. In one interview, she said with a calm matter-of-factness,
"My next great adventure, age 90, is going to be dying. There's either nothing or something, and if there's something, if there's nothing, and that's it. If there's something, I can't think of a greater adventure than finding out what it is."
That sentiment, clipped and reshared widely online, became one of the defining quotes associated with her death. To many, it seemed haunting. To others, it was a testament to her lifelong courage, the same bravery that led her, as a young woman without formal training, into the forests of Tanzania to live among wild chimpanzees. Another viral moment came from a different interview where she recalled how the question of her next adventure caught her by surprise. With her characteristic wit, she responded,
"Somebody the other day asked what my next big adventure would be, and nobody had asked me before, and I thought, if I'd been asked 10 years ago, I'd say, into the wild places of Papua New Guinea, but I couldn't do that now. So I said dying, and there was a kind of shocked silence and a few titters. And then I said, well, when you die, you either, there's nothing, which is fine, or there's something. And if there is something which I just happen to feel, although I couldn't begin to prove it, then I can't think of a greater adventure than finding out what it is."
These were not the words of someone shying away from mortality. They were the reflections of a scientist who had spent her entire life observing the cycles of life and death in the natural world. She had seen chimpanzee mothers cradle dead infants for days, refusing to let go. She had witnessed the brutal wars between rival groups in Gombe. For her, death was not alien. It was an inseparable part of the story of life. And so, when Goodall did pass away in California of natural causes, while still working well into her 90s, her final reflections on death were ready to be seized upon. As one broadcast put it,
"Some sad news to end on today. Jane Goodall, the iconic anthropologist and conservationist, has died. She was 91 years old. The British scientist was best known for her lifelong study of chimpanzees and was in California for a speaking engagement when she passed of natural causes. Yes, she was still working into her 90s.
The combination of her serene acceptance of death, the continued energy she carried into her 90s, and the darker footage of chimpanzee violence from her research archives created a strange, compelling narrative online. The disturbing footage often had less to do with Goodall herself and more with her animals, their violent wars, their infanticides, their cannibalism, discoveries that she had brought to the world decades earlier. But to understand why her death resonated in this way, why clips of chimpanzees at war were placed alongside headlines of her passing, one has to step back and look at the arc of her life. Because Jane Goodall was not just another scientist. She was a figure who bridged two worlds, the quiet, meticulous realm of field biology and the unpredictable, messy, and very human realm of public imagination. Jane Goodall's story begins far from Africa, in London, where she was born Valerie Jane Morris Goodall on April 3rd, 1934. From the beginning, animals were at the center of her imagination. As a toddler, she was gifted a stuffed chimpanzee named Jubilee belief which she carried with her for years, a foreshadowing of the deep connection she would later form with real chimpanzees in the wild. Her childhood was filled with books that transported her into jungles and animal kingdoms. Dr. Dolittle, The Jungle Book, Tarzan of the Apes. They weren't just stories for her, they were maps of a life she dreamed of living. She once recalled hiding for hours in her family's henhouse, silently watching a chicken lay an egg. For a 5-year-old, this act of patience, curiosity, and focus was unusual, and it revealed the same qualities that would define her as a researcher decades later. Encouragement from her mother, Van Morris Goodall, was crucial. At a time when young girls were not expected to pursue science, Van treated Jane's curiosity not as a distraction, but as a gift. She nurtured the dream, even when it meant entertaining the idea of her daughter moving to the forests of Africa with no university degree, no money, and no roadmap. Goodall could not afford higher education. After finishing school at Uplands in Bournemouth, she trained in secretarial work, but she never lost sight of her dream. She worked as a waitress, a typist, and in various other jobs, saving every spare penny. Finally, at age 23, she bought a ticket to Kenya, setting sail in 1957, a decision that would alter not just her life, but the way the world understood animals. In Nairobi, her path crossed with Louis Leakey, the renowned paleoanthropologist searching for insights into human origins. Leakey recognized something extraordinary in this young woman, a fierce curiosity unburdened by academic convention. Where others saw her lack of formal training as a weakness, Leakey saw potential. He hired her as his assistant at the Corendon Museum, assigning her to tasks like cataloging fossils and observing vervet monkeys. It was an apprenticeship that sharpened her skills and, more importantly, set her on a trajectory toward the forest. By 1960, Leakey had secured funding for an unprecedented project, sending Goodall into Gombe Stream National Park in what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania. She was just 26 years old when she arrived on July 14th, accompanied by her mother, since colonial authorities would not permit a young woman to live alone in the bush. The mission was daunting. At the time, little was known about chimpanzees in the wild. They were thought of as little more than animals, without individuality, culture, or intelligence. Goodall's task was to watch, to record, and to reveal. The early months at Gombe were grueling. Goodall lived in a simple tent, cooking over a fire, battling insects and loneliness. Every day she climbed into the hills, binoculars in hand, scanning the canopy for chimpanzees that fled at her approach. They were wary, and for weeks, all she could see were distant shadows. Then came David Greybeard, the first chimpanzee to accept her presence. With his distinctive grey facial hair, he embodied patience and calm. By tolerating her nearby, he opened the door to others. Slowly, the community of chimpanzees began to reveal itself, one individual at a time. This was the moment that transformed Jane Goodall from an outsider to a participant in their world. She did not assign them numbers, as most scientists would have done. She gave them names: Flo, Fifi, Goliath. She saw personalities in them: boldness, shyness, aggression, tenderness. Critics accused her of anthropomorphism, of projecting human qualities onto animals, but Goodall insisted she was simply describing what she observed. It was this approach, empathetic yet precise, that set her apart. It also meant that when she later reported acts of shocking violence among chimpanzees, the world listened with a mix of disbelief and fascination. These weren't faceless animals, they were individuals, and they could be loving, but also brutal. To understand why her own reflections on death resonated so deeply, consider the behaviors she documented. She watched mothers cradle dead infants for days, as if unwilling to accept the finality of loss. She described siblings' grief and the silent mourning that rippled through the forest. These scenes of death in the animal world shaped her understanding of mortality, not as something to fear, but as a universal thread. It's no coincidence, then, that when she spoke about her own death, she did so without dread. To her, death was an extension of the natural order she had observed so closely. That perspective, now circulating in viral clips, struck many as disturbing. But for Jane Goodall, it was the same calm acceptance she had always shown, whether facing a termite mound with curiosity or documenting the carnage of a chimpanzee war. Her death at 91 marked the end of one life, but the footage, the reflections, and the animals she studied ensured that her story, with all its light and darkness, would continue to ripple outward. But the same patient eyes that watched the forest's gentlest moments also recorded its most unsettling truths, and those disturbing discoveries would come to define her legacy as much as her wonder. Her animals, her discoveries, and the dark side. When the world learned that Jane Goodall had died at 91, the tributes poured in. Yet alongside the memorials, another type of content surged online, compilations of violent chimpanzee footage paired with headlines about her death. These weren't random clips, they were drawn directly from the shocking discoveries Goodall herself had made decades earlier, discoveries that shattered our assumptions about what it meant to be human and what it meant to be an animal. To understand why people associated disturbing footage with her passing, we need to step into the forest at Gombe, where Goodall's decades of patient observation revealed the complexity and at times the brutality of chimpanzee life. In 1960, just months into her fieldwork, Jane Goodall made the observation that would catapult her into scientific history. Chimpanzees use tools. She watched David Greybeard strip leaves from a twig and insert it into a termite mound, extracting insects to eat. Not only was this tool use, it was tool making. At the time, tool use was considered a defining feature of humanity. To suggest that another species not only used, but also crafted tools was revolutionary. Louis Leakey, her mentor, captured the weight of the moment when he declared, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." This single observation broke the wall separating humans from animals in the scientific imagination. But it was only the beginning. For years, chimpanzees were thought to be gentle vegetarians. Goodall overturned that belief. She documented coordinated hunts where groups of males chased colobus monkeys through the trees, cornering and killing them. She described males sharing meat to form alliances or entice females. Political currency in the forest. Even more shocking were the cases of cannibalism. On rare but unforgettable occasions, she watched chimpanzees kill and consume infants, sometimes from rival groups, sometimes from their own. These revelations horrified not only the public, but Goodall herself, who had once hoped chimpanzees were nicer than humans. The footage of these hunts and killings, preserved in documentaries, retold in books, and archived in her notes, became some of the most unforgettable images associated with her life's work. It is little wonder that, in the wake of her death, these disturbing moments resurfaced online, intertwined with the news of her passing. Goodall also revealed something far more nuanced. Chimpanzees weren't just killers, they were individuals with personalities, emotions, and relationships. She saw them hug, kiss, and hold hands to reconcile after fights. She described mothers like Flo, who was nurturing and dominant, and daughters like Fifi, who carried her lineage forward. Her naming of the chimpanzees, rather than numbering them, drew criticism at first. Scientists accused her of anthropomorphism, but Goodall's meticulous notes made clear these were not projections. These were observable behaviors that mirrored the emotional lives humans claim as uniquely our own. She saw joy, such as chimps performing rain dances in storms. She saw grief when mothers carried the lifeless bodies of their infants for days, unable to let go. And she saw cunning, in the form of deception, when individuals hid their intentions to gain advantage. By the 1970s, it was clear chimpanzees were not a simple mirror of human kindness or cruelty. They embodied both. And nowhere was this clearer than in the event that came to be known as the Gombe Chimpanzee War. From 1974 to 1978, Goodall and her team witnessed a sustained conflict between two groups of chimpanzees in Gombe, the Kasakela and the Kahama. What began as a community split escalated into a systematic campaign of violence. Kasakela males patrolled their borders, moving silently in coordinated raids, a behavior eerily reminiscent of human warfare. When they found a Kahama male alone, they attacked with brutal efficiency. Goodall recorded how Goodall, one of the first victims, was dragged from a tree and beaten to death. Over the following years, one by one, the Kahama males were hunted down and killed. By the end, the Kahama community had been annihilated. Their territory was absorbed by the Kasakela. Goodall described the killings in detail: the bites, the screams, the flesh torn from bodies, and even moments of cannibalism by the victors. The scientific world was stunned. The public was shaken. The idea that chimpanzees, so close to us genetically, could wage organized war forced a reckoning with our own violent past. As disturbing as the war was, Goodall also documented violence within communities. The most notorious example involved Passion, a female chimpanzee, and her daughter Pom. Between 1974 and 1976, they killed and ate multiple infants from other females in their own group. Goodall struggled to explain these acts. They were not driven by hunger. They seemed to be strategic, reducing competition for resources and increasing reproductive advantage. It was a chilling reminder that violence was not limited to males, nor to territorial disputes. This was the footage, mothers eating infants, males tearing rivals apart, that resurfaced online online alongside reports of Goodall's death. It was disturbing then, and it remains disturbing now. Yet to Goodall, these observations were essential. They were part of the truth of chimpanzee life, and by extension, part of the truth of our own evolutionary story. Goodall herself admitted the impact these discoveries had on her worldview. Early in her career, she hoped chimpanzees might be a window into a gentler side of human nature. Instead, she found that their societies, like ours, balanced compassion with cruelty. She reflected that chimpanzees were capable of a dark side, and that this forced her to reconsider the origins of human aggression. Scholars like Richard Wrangham later built on her work with theories such as the demonic males hypothesis, suggesting that territorial aggression in both humans and chimps shares deep evolutionary roots. But Goodall never reduced chimpanzees to killers. She insisted on holding both truths at once, their capacity for tenderness and for violence. When Jane Goodall died, it was natural for people to revisit her life's work. But because her most famous discoveries involved unsettling realities, tool use that blurred the human-animal divide, and wars that mirrored our own, the imagery that circulated was not just of a scientist smiling with chimpanzees, it was of the animals themselves, caught in the raw, disturbing footage of their most violent acts. The online framing of death footage played on this duality. It was not Jane Goodall's own death being sensationalized, but the deaths she had documented of chimpanzees at the hands of each other, now used as a backdrop for her passing. It was, in a sense, fitting. Her career was built on telling the world hard truths about animals that many preferred to romanticize. Even in death, her legacy carried both wonder and discomfort. Yet, even after revealing this darker side of nature, Jane Goodall refused to let despair be her final word. Instead, she turned her life's work toward hope, action, and a lasting fight for the future legacy. Reactions to her death and conservation impact. When Jane Goodall's death at 91 was confirmed, the news spread quickly, not only through traditional outlets but across platforms where millions encountered her words and images in short, viral bursts. The story was framed in many ways as the end of an era in primatology, as the passing of a beloved conservationist, and, in some corners, through the unsettling visuals of chimpanzee violence that had marked her career. But what truly came into focus in the days following her passing was not just the disturbing footage that reappeared online, but the extraordinary legacy she left behind, a legacy that blended science, advocacy, and an unshakable hope for the future. Even in her last years, Goodall's schedule would have been grueling for someone half her age. She traveled up to 300 days a year, speaking at universities, conservation forums, and international summits. She used her voice to link the plight of chimpanzees to the broader challenges facing the planet: climate change, habitat destruction, unsustainable consumption, and poverty. In one of her final interviews, she explained her philosophy of conservation as inseparable from social justice.
So our Jane Goodall Institute method of conservation is working to alleviate poverty, because that is one, on the one hand, you get overconsumption, you get unsustainable lifestyles, and on the other hand, you get poverty where people either, if they're rural, destroy the environment to get some money from timber or destroying the landscape for growing some crop just to survive. Unless you alleviate poverty and reduce our unsustainable lifestyle, surely we can find a way. Because if we don't, that's the end of our species. Humans are not exempt from extinction.
This perspective, that saving nature required addressing both overconsumption and poverty, set her apart. She did not treat conservation as a separate, abstract issue. She understood it as a human problem, tied to the everyday choices and struggles of people across the globe. Following her death, tributes highlighted not only her discoveries, but her character. Broadcasters, scientists, and activists spoke of her determination and humility. The naturalist Chris Packham, reflecting on his encounters with her, described her as someone who did everything her way and with enormous energy, and noted how she used her voice calmly and in a dedicated fashion to speak up for life on Earth. He recalled that she had revealed the darker truths of chimpanzee society, infanticide, cannibalism, and warfare, while at the same time insisting on hope. That balance of honesty and optimism, Packham suggested, was why her message resonated so deeply. Even when confronting violence in the natural world or destruction caused by humans, she maintained sustained a belief in the possibility of repair. The Jane Goodall Institute itself honored her with a statement that summed up her dual role as scientist and advocate. Dr. Goodall's discoveries as an ethologist revolutionized science, and she was a tireless advocate for the protection and restoration of our natural world. Founded in 1977, the Jane Goodall Institute, JGI, became the vehicle for her vision of conservation. What began as a means to support long-term research at Gombe expanded into a global organization working in over 30 countries. JGI combined rigorous science with grassroots projects, emphasizing that conservation could not succeed without local communities being active partners. Programs like Takere, Take Care in Tanzania, provided support for health, education, and sustainable livelihoods in villages around chimpanzee habitats. The philosophy was simple but powerful. People would only protect wildlife if their own basic needs were met. By investing in human well-being, JGI built conservation into the fabric of daily life. Her Roots and Shoots program, founded in 1991, carried her influence into classrooms and youth groups around the world. Active in more than 60 countries, Roots and Shoots empowered young people to create community projects on behalf of animals, the environment, and other people. Goodall often said it was these young activists that gave her the greatest hope.
Well, my reasons for hope are the energy, commitment, and determination, and very often the courage of young people. And that's our program is in over 65 countries around the world and growing.
These weren't empty words. She had spent decades witnessing young leaders take up conservation as a cause, and she believed their energy was proof that change was still possible. As tributes revisited her career, many retold the stories of her most unsettling findings: chimpanzee warfare, infanticide, cannibalism. These were shocking when first reported, and they remain shocking today. For some, it was easier to sensationalize them as disturbing footage than to grapple with what they meant. But Goodall herself never shied away from these truths. Instead, she insisted that to truly know chimpanzees, we must accept the whole of their nature. They were capable of kindness and cruelty, compassion and violence. In them, we saw a mirror of our own species, not simplified, but complicated. This insistence on complexity is part of why her legacy endures. She refused to flatten the natural world into a caricature. By showing us chimpanzees as individuals with emotions, strategies and dark impulses, she challenged us to look at humanity with the same honesty. Despite decades of observing violence in both chimpanzee and human societies, Goodall's final years were defined not by despair, but by hope. She often said that her optimism came from three sources: the resilience of nature, the power of the human intellect, and above all, the determination of young people. In one of her last public reflections, she emphasized this balance between realism and optimism, and this was reiterated by one of her colleagues.
We're not lost, but we're in danger of losing unless we act very quickly. And Jane understood that. That's why she was on the road until she was 91 years old. She couldn't give up, because to give up is to lose everything, and we simply can't afford to lose it.
For her, hope was not a passive feeling. It was an active responsibility, a duty to continue speaking, traveling, and teaching, even when age and exhaustion might have excused her. The viral death footage narrative, which merged her passing with clips of chimpanzee violence, reflects the dual nature of her legacy. On one side, there is the disturbing reality of what she revealed, that chimpanzees, like humans, can wage wars and commit horrors. On the other, there is the life she chose to build from those discoveries, one of advocacy, compassion, and relentless effort to protect the natural world. To frame her story only through disturbing images would be a disservice, but to ignore those images would also be to deny the courage it took to document them in the first place. Jane Goodall's life was not about sanitizing reality. It was about looking directly at it and then asking what we could do better. As Chris Packham put it in his tribute,
She did everything her way and with enormous amounts of energy. Jane Goodall Institute is world renowned. She's used her voice calmly and in a dedicated fashion to speak up for life on Earth against all of the threats that it now faces. And in many ways, Jane has just died on the job, the job that her life became, and that was protecting life on Earth.
that encapsulates her legacy. Jane Goodall did not separate her life from her work. To the very end, she was both scientist and activist, documenting the natural world and fighting to protect it. Her death at 91 was the closing of a personal chapter, but her story continues in every researcher who draws on her Gombe data, in every child inspired by Roots and Shoots, and in every community lifted by the programs of the Jane Goodall Institute. The footage that circulates now may be disturbing, but it is also instructive. It reminds us of the truth she spent her life uncovering, that to understand our place in the natural world, we must look at it in its entirety, the beauty, the brutality, and the possibility of hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.